The title for our keynote address comes in the form of a question. Is there compelling evidence of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt? This question has been answered by numerous scholars in the negative. Textbook after textbook, classroom lecture after classroom lecture, in colleges, universities, and seminaries worldwide will tell you flatly that there is no evidence from history, archaeology, or related disciplines that the Israelites ever were in Egypt. Now, some liberal scholars will still make some room for Moses in the realm of myth and legend, but not in the realm of history or fact. Liberal theologians may even say that Moses has a rightful place in religious belief, but they separate religion from fact. They separate subjective meaning from objective truth. I hope that you realize that this liberal worldview hinges upon a false distinction between fact and faith, as if the two realms never connect. No question about it, the content of Scripture is a matter of faith. But why can't it be a matter of fact simultaneously? Christians profess that fact and faith come together in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. And that's not the only place where faith and fact come together. The Old Testament is full of examples that simultaneously are religious and historical. And so we may ask anew, is there compelling evidence, the sort of evidence that ought to waken up a skeptic from stubbornness or ignorance concerning the Israelite sojourn in Egypt? To address that question fully, one would have to talk with a pastor, a seminary professor, an archaeologist, a linguist, and our keynote speaker is all of those things. Dr. Douglas Petrovich currently serves as a professor of biblical history and exegesis at the Bible Seminary in Cary, Texas. He is author of numerous articles that connect the Old Testament with its history, chronology, linguistics, and archaeology to the ancient world. Those of you familiar with the Concordia commentary series on 1 Kings may have noted a footnote or two referencing his work. Dr. Petrovich also has been featured on Answers in Genesis, their website, and in the Patterns of Evidence and Thinking Man video series produced by Timothy Mahoney. Dr. Petrovich has argued in his book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, that it was not the Phoenicians who invented the first alphabet, but rather a group of sojourners in Egypt and Sinai, spanning the time period from Joseph to Moses, as shown on page 8 of your handout. If Dr. Petrovich is correct, then not only is there some evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt, but the Israelites themselves played a central role in establishing one of the great pillars of civilization, the alphabet, shown on page 9 of your handout. Let's welcome now Dr. Douglas Petrovich.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. Thank you for everyone who's come out this evening to attend the conference and to hear some examples of amazing things that God has done in ancient history. And thank you to all who are watching online live or a taped version of this. It's great to have you as well. We hope that you are able to follow along all the way from beginning to end and that you have no interruptions. So, our topic today for certain is an attempt to answer this question. Is there compelling evidence of Israelite sojourn in Egypt that the Bible talks about as taking place over a period of 430 years? And the answer, I'm convinced, is absolutely yes. And that's what I'm here tonight to attempt to persuade you of when you look at the evidence. So, a couple introductory matters I want to quickly cover. First, I'm not going to prove to you, or attempt to prove to you, the chronological framework by which my understanding of ancient history hinges. I'm going to assume it to be true. If I had more time, more hours with you, I would do that. I would spend time attempting to prove that to you, passage by passage with Israelite history, and then looking at the evidence from Egyptology, including ancient historical Egyptian records that very carefully date events that take place, some of which are tied into what we call astronomical events, meaning events that are recorded that take into account something that happened in the heavens with astronomy. So I can't provide that framework for you. I'm assuming it to be true, but don't think that I can't attempt to prove it to you. I hope that's clear. 1 Kings 6:1, of course, is the hub. It's the central text in all of the Hebrew Bible for establishing the chronology. And really, if you don't establish a sound and correct chronological framework, you really have very little chance of correctly identifying events that take place in the ancient world with what you read about in the Bible, if the Bible does address those ancient events. All right, next, as far as tools that can help you, as Dr. McPherson mentioned, I have 7 published articles now, the most recent one being just a few weeks ago that published, on my academia.edu webpage. Now, I don't know how many of you have Facebook, but I have great news for you. You can throw away your Facebook because the real Facebook is academia.edu. Because there you can get amazing scholarship from scholars all around the world in pretty much any field that you want to study. And I've downloaded literally hundreds, if not over 1,000, I've downloaded hundreds of articles that I've read, that I've benefited from, that have helped my scholarship, and actually my past studies as a student as well. So go to academia.edu if you're interested. All you have to do is Google academia.edu, my name, and it will take you to my page. You may have to become a member to download anything, my articles or anything else that you would want to pull off of there. If that's the case, do it. There's no obligation. You can do it for free. There's also a premium service that you pay, I don't know, $10 a month or something for, that you can do. I don't do that. I just have the free version. But I encourage you to do that, not only for my work, but for the work of many scholars around the world whose work you should be reading and can be reading. So I want to point out a couple, 2 or 3 sources that will tie together what I'm talking to you about tonight. First is one of my recent articles, a 2019 article in the Near Eastern Archaeological Society Bulletin, called Determining the Precise Length of the Israelite Sojourn in Egypt. And if you don't know it, there's a dispute about this, and this article represents, it's funny, I was told that this is a really long article by one young scholar. It presents the most thorough discussion of this topic that I know of that's in print anywhere. So you will want to consult that if that's an important issue. And certainly it hinges upon or all I'm going to talk about tonight hinges upon being correct that it's 430 years, as Exodus 12:40 and 41 says, to the very day. Second, my most recent article, I'm sorry, no, that's the last. Second is the book that is just about to publish. Hopefully it will be out by the end of the summer or early fall. This is my second book. It's just as, if not more, controversial than my first book, which was, when it came out, the most controversial book in the world of ancient Near Eastern studies. This is called Origin of the Hebrews, New Evidence for Israelites in Egypt from Joseph to the Exodus. And that is essentially, in crystallized form, what I want to share with you tonight. Then, as kind of an extra that's not really applicable to what I talk about tonight, but if you're interested in what's called the United Monarchy, which is the Israelite monarchy before they split into 2 kingdoms, right? We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Before that split, there's the United Kingdom. Scholars argue against the historicity of this kingdom vehemently and have been doing so since at least the 1980s. So this is one of the hot-button topics in universities all around the world that really becomes a focal point for criticism of the Bible and biblical historicity. So the Exodus and the Israelites in Egypt for 430 years, that's probably the area of greatest attack, and second would be this united monarchy. So I wrote an article on a site called Kirbeit Kayafa, and I tried to solve the question of whether or not the site of Kirbeit Kayafa is connected to King Saul or to King David or to both kings. So that's a really important article. It was a lot of fun to write this. It's newly hot off the press, and I encourage you to read it. Again, it's downloadable for free on my academia.edu webpage. All right, let's get into tonight's fun. We want to start with a look at the biblical text and a site plan for the site that I'm 100% convinced is what we read about in the Bible as the place where Jacob and his family settled when they moved down from Canaan into Egypt. In the Bible, it's referred to as Ramses. That's the site of Avaris. So here's what it says in Genesis 47:11. Now Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and he gave them property in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land. And here it is, in the land of Ramesses, just as that which Pharaoh had commanded. Now, there's a problem here. First of all, many of us in this room, I don't know if you're included, I'm included in this group, are committed to what's called an early Exodus view, which means that the Israelites left Egypt in the middle of the 15th century BC, and specifically I would say 1446 BC, and one of my articles actually argues for the exact day that it takes place, and that's in my book that's just about to publish as well, a more expanded and updated version of that. So that being the case, look at my note there. Ramses II in his years, regnal years, and so if you see dates next to a king's name, these are not his birth and death dates, these are his regnal years, when he reigned. And his reign was from 1290 to 1223. You can see it's an extremely extensive or long reign. That Ramses II built the city of Per-Ramesses as his capital city. Does this require a 13th century BC Exodus date? And certainly if your name is Cecil B. DeMille or Walt Disney, you would say yes, it requires a 13th century Exodus date. But I would beg to differ, and a number of other Christian scholars would beg to differ with this. So I want to take your attention to one of the most reliable sources today on planet Earth. Let's all say it together. Wikipedia. Yes. There is actually good that can be found on Wikipedia, and I was so excited to see this. I always like to share what you find. And it's on the site of Kantir. Kantir is the Arabic name for the site of Ramesses, Per-Ramesses, what Ramses II founded and built and made his capital sometime in the 13th century BC. And most late Exodus advocates don't even have an exact year that they settle on. Well, you should have an exact year because the Bible is very exact about its chronology. So Kantir is the name of that site, right? And look what's in the red box. I don't know if you can read this. I'll read it for you. It's kind of small. I have to have my glasses to see it nowadays. The ancient site of Avaris is located around 2 kilometers south of Kantir. And I would correct that to southeast of Kantir. This was the older city in the area. That is, Avaris was the older city. Later on, and here's the point, later on, Avaris was absorbed by Ramesses. Wikipedia is exactly right. It was absorbed. It all became part of the same city. Late Exodus advocates will not tell you that this is the case. They hide that information from you if they know it themselves. Why? Because the claim that the Exodus must have happened in the 13th century BC is primarily based on this text and Exodus 1:11, which is a parallel passage, identifying Ramesses as the site where the Israelites settled. That's their main argument. But that argument dissipates if it's all one site. How can this work? Well, I'm here to show you how this can work. So first of all, we have to look at where Avaris is, and I'm going to point to this with my cursor. So my cursor is pointing to this red dot in what's called the Eastern Nile Delta, and the delta, of course, represents a triangular-shaped object that essentially is a way of expressing what the delta looked like. And so right in this Eastern Nile Delta is the site of Avaris. Well, an inscription was found on a shrine door dating to the 20th dynasty of Egypt. That is, the 1100s or the 1000s BC. And this inscription, this shrine door, is now in the Pushkin Museum, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but is in the country of Russia, where I lived for 10 years. And it mentions a certain kind of Egyptian priest called a Wab priest. And it says that he was a Wa priest of the god Amun. That's one of the gods in Egypt's pantheon of gods. It's one of the solar deities, who was located at the harbor of Avaris. So the inscription says, in, let's say, 1150 BC, or whatever year we pick, 1100 BC, it says, the priest was standing at the harbor in Avaris. Was he? Could he have been? Well, let's look more closely. So here is kind of a mid-range view of Avaris as you see it in relation to the Mediterranean Sea. It's located in this area. So the southwest if I didn't mention that before, southwest is what I wanted to say, of Kantir or Paramasi, that's traditional Avaris. That's where the Egyptians first settled, and then later these Asiatics that I'm suggesting we connect to the Israelites, they settled there as well. But here is Kantir. And then you can see that the Nile River branches off into a number of tributaries and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And along this area around Avaris, we call this the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And there, of course, is a very important and famous road that essentially ends at Avaris. And if you're taking it into Asia, for example, you take this road like this. Follow that all the way. It's going to start hugging the Mediterranean Sea coast, more or less, and it's going to work its way around that corner, that rounded end of the Mediterranean Sea, and go up into Asia, into the place we call the Levant. And of course, the Levant is the name for ancient Israel, and which used to be Canaan before that, ancient Phoenicia, and ancient Syria. All that area is the Levant. There's the northern Levant and the southern Levant. Israel, of course, is known as the southern Levant. So this is the road that would take you there. All right, now let's really get down to business here. This is more of a blow-up of this area. We see the Pelusiac Nile, branch of the Nile that's flowing here upward in the picture, and then kind of makes a diagonal right turn. And so all of this is the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And all of this area here down to the lower left, that's traditional older Avaris. Paramasi is the area up in the upper right in the image. So the Wa priest would have been somewhere up here in the residential area of Paramasi, and he worked his way downhill, probably slightly, to the coast, and all of a sudden he comes upon this bulge right here, which is a harbor. That's where ships would dock in the Ramesside period. But that's not the harbor of traditional Avaris. Everyone who understands the New Kingdom in Egypt's history knows that Avaris's harbor, and actually they had two, but their main harbor was this one right here in the middle of this otherwise plot of land that's in white. So this area in the very middle of the photo almost is Avaris's harbor. But the priest says, I'm at Avaris's harbor. Why does he say that when instead he would have been here? Because this, Avaris's harbor, was abandoned at the time. He had no reason to go there. There weren't ships coming in and out. There weren't places to buy food. There weren't places to speak with people. It's empty. It's a ghost town kind of a harbor. It's probably in disrepute by this time. So he goes to this harbor and he calls it the harbor of Avaris. You know what that tells us? That the ancient Egyptians themselves viewed the city of Paramasi as Avaris. It's part of the overall city of Avaris. So, when the biblical text refers to Ramesses, it's not confined to Paramasi of the 13th dynasty and afterward. No, because to the Egyptians, it's all one site. So the question then comes, and that's the old harbor there to the left. The question comes as to what about the identification of this name Paramasi? How do we account for that? One quick note for you. I have a phasing scheme right here for you. It's really in small detail. You probably can't see it very well. I haven't put it up on my academia.edu webpage yet. I eventually will. It is one of the important plates in my book that's about to come out, and it essentially attempts to identify certain places in Avaris and lines up time periods with people and with events and so forth, and gives you the right chronological framework. So be looking out for that in the future, if in my book, if not somewhere else. Well, there are two main areas in that phasing scheme that we want to look at. One is what's called F1, capital F, capital 1, or Roman numeral 1. It's mainly all of this area over here. That's area F1, lower left in the photo. And then up here near the top is area R1. This is going to become important to us. And this rectangular black object here is a temple that was built by the Egyptians before the Israelites settled at the site. That was a temple that was built to worship the founder of the 12th dynasty. His name was Amenemhat the first. So the temple was built to worship a deceased king. And if you're not familiar with this, this is very common in the ancient world. It happened all the time. The Greco-Macedonians did it, the Romans did it, everybody did it. And it was done much earlier. So in this phasing scheme, R1 is this column here, F1 is this column here, and the time when the Israelites settle is in the Middle Kingdom. It's in the 12th dynasty, and there's a Roman numeral 12 on the lower left part of the grid that shows you that it's the 12th dynasty. Let's see, right here, D2 and D1, these are the two main strata. A stratum is a level, an archaeological level that we're convinced is of a certain time period in an ancient site, right? And there's one stratum. If you have two or more, it's strata. So these two strata are very important because the Asiatics, who I'm claiming are Israelites, settle during stratum D2 in area F1, which is equivalent to what's called phase H. So archaeologists often assign a phase to a certain stratum. So I could either be saying phase H or stratum D2. It's essentially the same thing. Then stratum D1, which is a long stratum, is the equivalent of G4, if you're looking in terms of phasing. So those designations will come up a little bit later. But, yeah, let's see. There's something missing here. Okay, I don't see the slide here. Maybe I'll come to it, but just in case I don't come to it, maybe I axed it out without intending to. Let's talk quickly about the reason why Ramesses is written in the biblical text. There's an article that came out in 2001 in JETS. It's called the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society by a scholar named Michael Grisanti. He's a professor at the Master's Seminary in Southern California. That's where I graduated. He was there for a few years in my final years as a student. He's still there. It's a groundbreaking article on a topic called textual updating that happens not with the Greek New Testament at all, but in very rare instances happens with the Hebrew Bible, where something in the text was updated by a later scribe. Doesn't mean the scribe ruined things. It doesn't mean the scribe was correcting a mistake, but updating something, adding something, or making something understandable but equivalent at the same time. One example of this is the city of Dan that's mentioned in the Pentateuch, which really wasn't identifiable yet as the city of Dan during Moses' lifetime. How could Moses refer to a site called Dan when there is no Dan yet there? And that's later in their history. Well, it's because a later scribe came in and put the word Dan there and made it understandable. Same goes with Ur of the Chaldeans, the site of Ur where Abraham was from, Abram. That wasn't Chaldean until about the 10th century BC. There were no Chaldeans there in southern Mesopotamia. That's a much later phenomenon. But of course, Abraham dates to the late 3rd millennium BC. There was a site of Ur, but it didn't belong to Chaldeans. So a later scribe came in and updated the text so that the readers of the day, folks, could understand where and what this city was, so that it could make sense. So I'd encourage you to read his article. It's extremely, I think, important in helping us to understand certain things in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament. And another example is the end of chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, which documents for us Moses' death and what happens long after his death. And that's included in Deuteronomy 34. It's not that there was some rogue bad guy scribe out there who was dirtying up the Pentateuch. No. He was writing the ending to the story under divine guidance to add things that we wouldn't have known from Moses himself. That's not bad or wrong. And it doesn't mean Moses isn't the author of the Pentateuch. He is. But this is a very small sliver where a scribe came along in the 1,000-year period, roughly, in which Hebrew scribes wrote the Hebrew Bible. It was of a different literary form, the Hebrew Bible, than the New Testament. For the New Testament, you write an epistle, it's done. There's no adding, subtracting, changing, nothing. You write a gospel, it's done. It's all over. But the Hebrew Bible was more fluid over that period of 1,000 years. And these scribal updates, done very rarely, not often, were done to improve the understanding for the reader. That being the case, no doubt in my mind, that added to the list of what Michael Grisanti calls these scribal updates is the site name for the city where Jacob settled his family. Because in Moses' day, it wasn't even called Avaris anymore. There was a new name for the city. That new name was Peru Nefer, which means pleasant journey. It's what you say, it's like bon voyage, right? When you leave a certain place and you're going somewhere else. And that's the name of the city in all of the documents of the middle of the 18th dynasty when Moses was alive. And near the end of the 18th dynasty, the usage of that name for the site, it went out of existence when, there was an abandonment of the site immediately after the Egyptian army died in the Sea of Reeds. But then after that, there was the name Peru Nefer went out of use altogether. So nobody in subsequent generations would know Peru Nefer, right? If you say pleasant journey, they wouldn't know what the site is. And certainly in the probably in the period of the judges, maybe the early monarchy, the scribes look at this and they say, we know that our readers are not going to understand Peru Nefer. Let's update it to the modern understanding, which is Per Ramesses, or Ramses, as is written in our Bibles. So this update was done not to tamper with the Bible, but to help people's understanding of it, right? It's a good thing they did, not a bad thing they did. And for that reason, that scribal update helped that generation of readers and potentially later readers as well. So that's how to explain why Ramses is in the text, when it didn't exist as Ramses until the 13th century BC. All right, let's look at some important chronological pegs for what we're going to talk about tonight. In 1885 BC, I suggest to you that Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, or actually pair of dreams. And then, of course, he was elevated immediately after. In 1878, that is when we have two things going on in the same year. There's a shift in the reigns, who's on the throne in Egypt, from Sesostris II to Sesostris III. The second event that happens that year is a switch, oddly enough, in that same year, from the 7 years of abundance to the 7 years of famine. So these events happen in the same year. So we can affectionately refer to Sesostris II as the abundance pharaoh, and Sesostris III as the famine pharaoh. So remember that, write that down on a piece of paper, in your mind, on your notepad, on your iPad, whatever. Then 1876, that's the important critical peg in biblical chronology, where we go 430 years back from the Exodus, which was in 1446, and it takes us to 1876, the year that Jacob entered Egypt with his family. Very important. And we're already in the midst. We're 2 years into the famine when that happens, right? Then 1859 is the year Jacob died, because the Bible says very clearly that Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt before he died. So 1859, Jacob dies, And another important event happens. Sesostris III, the what pharaoh? Famine pharaoh. Very good, some of you. The famine pharaoh. He brought his son, Amenemhat III, onto the throne. And there was what we call a co-regency, two rulers at the same time. Now, those of you in my generation, you know what's going on here. This is golf game time. He's going to go into semi-retirement, Sesostris III. And his son, make the son do all of the hard work of the daily decisions in Egypt. I don't want to mess with that anymore. I want to get under par, right? So he goes and enjoys semi-retirement in 1859 BC. 1805, that's the year that Joseph dies. Okay, so there we are. Sesostris II, abundance pharaoh. Sesostris III, famine pharaoh. Amenemhat III, the pharaoh whose rule began in the year of Jacob's death. That becomes very important to us because he's interconnected with the characters of the Bible of this generation. Now we're going to look at the site that I'm claiming is where Jacob settled. Remember, that's Avaris. We're going to look at the first Asiatic settlement there, phase of settlement there. That's stratum D2. If you remember, that's phase H in the phasing record. And that I'm connecting with the lifetime of Jacob. And later we'll be looking at stratum D1. It's the second Asiatic level at Avaris. And I connect that to the grandsons, two grandsons of Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh. So let's make a secure dating of the site. So there is a stela, that's an ancient piece of stone in this case, that was inscribed with writing in Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it's up in the upper right here in the yellow box, the beginning of it, where it says that it's the renal year, and then it gives the number 5. So the 5th year of the reign of a certain king. And here is his name in green. That's Sesostris. Actually, Senwasret in Egyptian, but it means Sesostris, the Greek form that we use, most of us today. And that's Sesostris III. And then it talks of events. So this inscription was found. Do you remember that temple I pointed out to you that's in area R1, that's really close to the Pulusiac branch of the Nile? That's where it was found, inside the temple. So this gives us a secure dating of the events of what we read about in the stela. Now think about this. If Sesostris the third, if Sesostris III entered onto the throne in 1878, and that happens to be the year that the famine begins, and it says here that this is year 5 of his reign, how far are we into the famine in Egypt? Yeah, we're in year 5 of the famine, and that's no accident. That the numbers work this way, folks, because of what we read on this inscription. This inscription was publicly published years ago in 1859 by a scholar named Shahata Adam, and he got some things right in the inscription, but some things he kind of messed up. And in my book there is an appendix that treats this inscription with a full inscription, with a full translation, and I think corrects the mistakes that he made in his translation of 1959. If I said 1859, I meant 1959. So you'll read about that in my book. And essentially it says this. We're going to skip all of the unimportant things. It's basically just exalting the king. And down to the important part, right here, it says, the digging of a dike for the temple estate of Amenemhat I, the justified. Where? At the mouth of the path that is alongside the waters of this city, north of the temple. Do you remember in the photo that we saw? Where was the temple? What was north of the temple? Water was north of the temple. Do you see how this fits? The length of the mouth of the path was uprooted. How much? What was the length? 26 cubits. And 26 royal cubits means 13.6 meters. So what did they do? They built a dike. What's a dike? It's a channel to connect something to a water source. Why would they need, in year 5 of Sesostris III, to connect a water source to the temple? Famine. What happens with famine? The water level drops. It recedes greatly. Does this not make perfect sense that they would build this dike? 5 years into the famine, remember, it got worse as time went along for people in Egypt. All right. Then it says, the stela was sealed by the hand of the sempriest. So there's an Egyptian sempriest, and it names him Eep. Aren't you glad you don't have the name Eep? Eep signed this stela. I haven't seen the stela with my own eyes. I would like to go with you to Egypt and find it in the museum and turn it over and look on the back and on the sides. You know what we'd find? We'd find the seal of Eep. That's what we would find. And it was also sealed, that's one half, now the other half. And it was sealed by the overseer of administrative division of foreign land. That's a fancy title, isn't it? It's a guy that kind of oversees the foreigners or anything happening with foreigners. That's that person. And I'll show you something very fascinating in a moment about that. And then it says, Horus is in his son. That's the name of this overseer of the administrative division of foreign land. His name is Horus is in his son. Horus is the name that the Egyptians gave to the king of the gods. Actually, he was the son of the original king of the gods who was killed by his own brother, and the falcon god, Horus, took over, and he became the king of the gods, right? That's how it works in the ancient world. You know, it's a cutthroat world. You have to survive, even as a god. So his name was the king of the gods is in his son, right? The king of the gods is in his son. Hold on to that thought for a moment. Who could that be? In whose son do you think was the king of the gods? Horus is in his son, the Levantine. And I've added in there because of the hieroglyph that's there. It's a determinative. I'll show you that in a minute. And then it says the workmanship. Now this is a different thought. The workmanship, and that could be the workmanship of the stela, or it could mean the workmanship of the dike. It's probably the dike. Is of my hand, head of the household. That's my title. I'm head of the household, whatever that means, right? Son of Sobek, the controller of this city. Horus is at the forefront, junior. Son of Horus, Horus is at the forefront, senior. So this guy takes the credit for overseeing or being in charge of or calling for the workmanship of the crafting or the construction of this dike to allow the priests to get water from the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. This guy is called the controller of this particular city. What does it mean? He's the mayor. He oversees this city. He is in charge of the city. And his name is, well, actually, he gives himself two names here. One, son of Sobek. Sobek is the god that's connected with an alligator, if you don't know. And the alligator god Sobek was seen as the god who provides for Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile River. Isn't that great? The Nile River is needed to provide life to the people. And this guy, whoever he is, we the Egyptians, we see him as the son of that God, the God who gives life to all of us through the waters of the Nile River. I don't know if you see what's shaping up here or not. And he's also called son of, he's also called Horus is at the forefront, junior. This means this guy always put the king of the gods at the forefront. Hold on to that thought. All right. On the right, you see the actual photo from 1959 of the stela, which is a little bit hard to work with, but you can work with it pretty well. And here is that, what I told you, this determinative, next to the name Horus is in his son, and that's a seated man showing that he's a human being. And then this picture is of a Levantine person, someone from the Levant. Where's the Levant? Ancient Canaan / Israel, ancient Phoenicia, ancient Syria. So this guy, we know his ethnicity, or close to it. That's the place that he comes from. He is one of those people. He's a Levantine person. Then I want you to look at the title of this guy who's called son of the God who provides through the life-giving waters of the Nile. And he's also called the king of the gods is at the forefront, junior. Right? His title is right here. This head hieroglyph, that's Cher, and there's a missing E sound that could be written there, but it's sometimes omitted. In this case, it's omitted, and there you have it. But the mouth here, that makes the r sound, so that works together with the r in cher. So we have Cary, and then this hieroglyph is a house, which is Per in Egyptian. Remember, I referred to Per Ramesses, house of Ramses. That's a house. You can see that it looks like it's supposed to be a full rectangle. That's the correct way of doing it in Egyptian. And at the middle, in the bottom, is an opening for the doorway. And that's how the Egyptians wrote a house, with the doorway blank to show where you come in. So this is really important. Cary Per. Cary Per means head of the household. So let's come back to that in a minute. Let's talk about the identity of this Sa Sobek and Horemheb Jr. All right, so he says this, the craftsmanship is of my hand, head of the household. If you look at Genesis 41:40, you know what it says about Joseph? It says this, Pharaoh talking. He's saying now to Joseph, whom he's elevating. Joseph, in effect, you will be over my household. That's what he says in Genesis 41:40. You will be over my household. What will you be, Joseph? Head of the household. And so this becomes a very important technical term for someone who oversees the house of the king. And what do you know? The Bible says that's one of the roles that Joseph played. But it doesn't end there. Look at this hieroglyph right here. This is fantastic. It doesn't mean much to you yet, but you see this guy here standing up. And I can hardly do this because I had rotator cuff reconstructive surgery, but I'll try. He's affectionately holding up his hands in what I call the touchdown hieroglyph, if you're a football fan, right? 6 points, this is what the ref does. That's what he's doing. That hieroglyph is very rarely used in Egyptian. There's just not that many times it's needed. And it had two essential meanings. Either it was something that was high, something tall, someone who is tall, whatever, something high into the air, or it can mean someone who is of a high position, so it's more abstract. And that's probably what this person is claiming. I am head of the household. Whose household? Doesn't say. Almost certainly it means the king. And because he puts that hieroglyph there, the touchdown hieroglyph, it means that he is a very high person in Egyptian culture. And he can't just do this, he just won't just do this arbitrarily. He does it because it's true of who he is. That's not the standard typical hieroglyph you would use for Cary Per. You would use a seated man hieroglyph. It's just a normal person hieroglyph. And that's it. But he uses this out of place touchdown hieroglyph to show that he is a very high person. So I ask you the question, could this be Joseph? Let's go on. There's a site called Magharah in Sinai. So remember, Avaris is located here in Lower Egypt, eastern Nile Delta. If you were to travel to the southeast through the Nile, the Sinai, you come all the way down to this area. You come to two sites, Magharah and Serebit El Khadim, where Egyptians sent expeditions to extract turquoise because it was a lucrative industry, and they could mine the turquoise and sell it on the market or use it for trade and make a killing with it. That's why they did it. So oftentimes there were annual trips, and there were large periods of times where no Egyptian expedition was sent. But during the 12th dynasty, Egypt was rich, especially during the reign of Sosostris III, oddly enough. And they would send almost annual later, they would send almost annual expeditions down there. Well, Magharah is the older of these two mining sites, exploited as early as Dynasty 3. And this site featured 3 mining camps, and it was mined during Dynasty 12. And that specifically is the lifetime of Joseph, according to biblical chronology. Look at what we find on one of the inscriptions down there. We find what? This is what kind of hieroglyph? The touchdown hieroglyph. The man with his arms extended high into the air. And by the way, the other meaning that can be used is praise. It can be used for exaltation. This is how you praise a deity in the ancient world. You raise your hands toward that deity who's higher than you are. So you could use it for praise as well. This is a very odd, and actually it's not a correct usage of this hieroglyph. This hieroglyph is only supposed to be used at the end of a word. It has no phonetic value. You don't pronounce it. So it would never, ever, ever come at the front of a word. But guess what? 3 times on these lines, 1, 2, 3, we see the touchdown hieroglyph starting a thought. That's wrong. This vertical stroke here, here, and here is telling us that what just came, which is the touchdown hieroglyph, is an ideogram. It's a hieroglyph that represents an entire concept. So this is a person, it's theoretically a high person, right? And then it says of, and then it gives where that person is of or from, or what is important about him that the writer is indicating. So this isn't supposed to appear like this. When does it appear like this? Look at this. Year 2 of Amenemhat III. Do you remember when Jacob dies and he causes Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandsons, to live among him? Do you remember when that year was? The transition where Sesostris III brought his son, Amenemhat III, onto the throne. I concluded this years ago, decades ago. I didn't know the significance of that precision until now. Year 1, Ephraim and Manasseh moved to Avaris with their uncles. Year 1. Year 2, there's somebody going down on these expeditions to extract turquoise who's writing this strange touchdown hieroglyph that we find on this Esbet Rushdie stela. That's year 5 of the famine, several decades earlier. This is 1874 BC, and this inscription is in the 1840s BC. No, 50s, 1858. It's in 1858 BC. Several decades later, this is written. That same strange high person hieroglyph. Okay, hold that thought. Now we have another inscription, vertical this time. From top to bottom, 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 top to bottom. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 indications of somebody starting a thought with a hieroglyph that's not supposed to be used this way. And at the end of each vertical line, you see a seated person, seated person, seated person. That means that's coming at the end of the word. That means it's a human being. This is the name of a person. But it's not just your average everyday Joe. It's somebody who's somehow connected to being really high in position. Hold that thought. That's year 6 of Amenemhat III. Then look at this. Remember our old friend Cary that's on the Esbet Rushdie stela? Look, here it is. Cary. But now, look, this house that's supposed to be a rectangle, right? This is the ultimate ideal shape. And Egyptian scribes always make it into a rectangle. They never make it into a square. This guy who wrote this in year 13 on Sinai 92 wrote it as a square, but left the doorway open like normal Egyptians would. Then he writes on this line the same thing, Cary, but this time. And Gardner, who published this book in the 1950s, he writes seek, as if this is an error, that he didn't enclose the house, the doorway on the house. Why? Because this person was already moving in some other direction. And we'll see that hopefully later if we have time. And again, touchdown hieroglyph at the end, touchdown hieroglyph at the end. So this is the exact construction we see years earlier on that Esbet Rushdie stela. That's under the authority of the person who claims to be the controller of this city. Son of Sobek, Horemheb Jr. There's a connection here. You couldn't have 2 absolutely wrong constructions decades apart unless they're connected. Asiatics were coming down from Avaris during these campaigns, during these expeditions to extract turquoise. So, Area F1, this is where the Israelites settled, and this is that temple, remember, we talked about with the Esbet Rushdie Stela. So, head of the household. This workmanship is of my hand, head of the household, son of Sobek. Who is son of Sobek? Do we know about him from anywhere else in Egyptian records? Yes, the answer is we do. On Seal 1336, it says, Sa Sobek is called Iri Wepet, he who is at the top. Who is Sa Sobek? It's the guy who's at the top of the food chain. Who's at the top of the food chain? Well, there's Pharaoh way up at the top, but right under him is the second in command. On Seal 1340, it says, Vizier who is in the front, Sa Sobek. And there it is, Vizier. That's the word chati in Egyptian. Anytime you have a chati, that's a person who is, and that means shrouded one. It's like he's covered with a veil and you can't really see through the veil what he looks like because he's too, I don't know if holy is the right word, but he's too up there. You're just a normal person. He's the shrouded one. So that's who Sa Sobek is. The guy, think of this, the guy who claims, I control the city of Avaris, where these Hebrews are. I am Vizier. Wow. Second in command in all of Egypt. What was Joseph? Second in command in all of Egypt. And then on Seal 1332, Sa Sobek is called Wartu A'at en Niut, great controller of the city. And this time, it's saying that he's not the controller of Avaris, where the Hebrews were, but when you have a random reference to the city, it's the capital. It's like Washington, D.C. And that's the city of Ich-Tawi. That's the capital in the 12th dynasty, the capital of Egypt. So this guy is in control of the capital of the nation. That's who Sa Sobek is. Well, why does he have time to mess around with a bunch of Hebrews in Avaris? You know why? If he's Joseph, it makes perfect sense. That's where his father lives. And probably a messenger came to tell Joseph that the priests living cat-a-corner from your family, they can't get any more water at their temple. So what does Joseph do? Gets on his horse, rides down to Avaris, and he fixes the problem. He builds a dike. What does a dike do? Connects water to people who need it. And that's what he did. I can't show you all of this tonight or in this conference, but if I had time, I would. It's in my second book that's about to come out. What Joseph first did when he was elevated as second in command over all of Egypt, he went to a city called Lahun. That was a ghost town, and he had it rebuilt. And he built a pyramid for his king because the number one important job of a vizier is to build the pyramidal city of his king. So his king has somewhere to be buried. And usually he builds his own tomb there and so forth. And builds other tombs and builds the city that's connected to it. That's what a vizier does. The reign of Sesostris II is strange to Egyptologists because he moved to a ghost town called Lahun, and there his pyramidal city was built. Who built it for him? His vizier. Who was his vizier? Joseph. Joseph built that vizier. And what did they do? It wasn't really just settling at Lahun because it's a new fad to move your king to a ghost town. Who wants to do that? Lahun was strategically located right in a break in a ridge that would allow an offshoot of the Nile River called the Bar Yusuf. If you would siphon the water to the west or the left, it would go into this valley, and you could use it as irrigating water to create crops. And it just so happened that Sesostris II is the king that all Egyptologists who understand the Middle Kingdom know that the exploiting of what's called the Fayum began in the reign of Sesostris II. What's the Fayum? The Fayum is that valley where the water was moved into. They created these waterways as irrigation channels, and they created this enormous supply of grain. You're going to read about it in my book. Why would they need an enormous supply of grain? famine was going to come, and it's time to prepare for the famine. What does Sasobek mean? Son of the God who provides, essentially for Egypt, the Egyptian people, through the life-giving waters of the Nile. That's what Joseph did. He built a dike there at Lahoun to funnel water into the Fayum, and it became Egypt's breadbasket. And guess what? It was their breadbasket all the way until the 20th century AD. During Roman times, this is the number one goal of the Roman emperor, to secure the Fayum to provide grain for the empire. Isn't that amazing? And it all was begun by Joseph. So he knows the blueprint, how to make a dike to channel water. So what does he do? I know this stuff. 5 years into the famine, he goes home to help out the priests. And that stela represents a deal that was struck between the Hebrews and the Egyptians there, and they worked together as a team, right? We want to talk about eliminating interracial tension. Work together as a team when you're of multiple cultures to help someone. That's what they did. And that's what is commemorated in that stela, the working together of the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Beautiful moment in biblical history. All right. Where are we at? 8:17. Who moved the clock forward and didn't tell me about it? Gee, this is terrible. Ephraim and Manasseh. So, let's add a couple dates. 1859 we know about. 1842, that's the earliest attested Proto-Consonantal Hebrew letter on an inscription. Remember D1 we're going to look at now. This is the level that I'm connecting to Ephraim and Manasseh. There's a relevant biblical passage here in Genesis 47. It says, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired possessions in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land 17 years. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, 'Take note, your father is sick.' So he, Joseph, took his two sons, his oldest, Manasseh, the older of the two, and Ephraim with him." That's what we're highlighting. "When it was told to Jacob, 'Look, your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed." Genesis 48. Let's skip down. "Now your two sons," right? Jacob speaking to Joseph. "Your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine." This, folks, is pure and simple theft. Jacob was stealing the two oldest sons of Joseph and taking them for himself and planting them among Joseph's brothers in the land of Goshen, at Avaris, for a purpose. Why? Because Jacob was about to die, and he knew the only way for his sons and their families to survive is to have some kind of connection to Egypt. Who can connect them to Egypt, right? They walk up to Jacob, and he can probably barely see, right? But he notices these guys are Egyptian. They're not Asiatic, they're Egyptian. They know Egyptian language, they know Egyptian culture, they know Egyptian religion. They know everything about Egypt because they were raised in Egypt, and they were raised as the sons of the vizier. Beautiful plan. They can help their uncles survive. And that's exactly what they did. This is one of the most important moments in biblical history. They will be called, but as for your offspring that have been born after them, they will be yours. So Jacob allowed the other sons of Joseph to be his. All right, so I'm suggesting to you that the house of Ephraim and Manasseh is in this black area in what's called Area F1 at Avaris. Here it is on the far left, and now it's a red asterisk that's near it, and that's where this massive building was built. And here it is. It took the archaeologists over 4 decades, folks, to excavate all of this, and they didn't even excavate the entire structure. Room after room after room. Somebody was loaded with money. When they were just about done with let's skip that. All right, so all of this represents the the construction of people with, when the archaeologists had started to construct all of this area, they thought of something, that this has to be a palace. Why? Because it is so elaborate and it just goes on room after room after room. But what is it that you have to have in a palace for it to be a palace? Throne room, exactly. No throne room, no throne, no palace. So how do you call it a palace when there's no throne room? I want to show you the tomb of D. Sobek Emchat, the man that I'm connecting to Ephraim. So there's this tomb here. It dates to stratum D1. That's the second occupational phase. I'm saying that I'll tell you ahead, I'm reading the end of the book for you. This is Ephraim's tomb, D. Sobek Emchat. And so here's kind of a blow-up of his tomb. You can see it's this blue. And then here is a closer image with the collapsed roofing superstructure on top of it. You can see that there's a donkey burial here. There's a goat burial here, a donkey burial here. So whoever died and was buried here was really connected to his animals. And of course, donkeys are not Egyptian animals at this time. This has to be an Asiatic. So when you remove the superstructure and you look at the contents in the tombs that are here, plural tombs, within the greater tomb, the one that's in the upper left on our screen, right here in red, that's the tomb of the male owner of this tomb. His name is D. Sobek Emchat. And that's a blow-up of a drawing of his bones. So you're looking at a drawing of the bones of Joseph's son, Ephraim, right here. And among all of these, the bones, there were grave goods. And there were faience beads. There was a golden bracelet. There was a silver bracelet. There was an alabaster jar. There was a socketed javelin head that was silver or bronze. So these are the things of a person who has a lot of money. The average Asiatic doesn't have a lot of money. Now the sons of Joseph, the vizier, they're loaded. They can get whatever they want. So what we want to focus on is right here, number 3. That's this amethyst scarab and golden ring. Isn't this beautiful, this purple amethyst? And there's an inscription right here. So when you look at the hieroglyphs here and you see there's a part that's missing at the top, that can be reconstructed. And it can be reconstructed because the virtual exact, the mirror image of this is from an inscription down in the mines in Sinai. Right? Remember, Serabit el-Khadim, one of the 2 sites where they would go and extract turquoise? And there it says, Sen en cheka en rechenu chebederem. Doesn't that bless you? That's son of the ruler of Rechenu. Rechenu is the Egyptian name for the Levant. Somebody who came from the Levant. And then it gives his name, Chebederem. And the M is actually optional. It could be Chebeded, could be Chebederem. So because of what's here, we know to reconstruct this part so that the scarab from that rich person at Avaris, we know that we can reconstruct his name to D. Sobek Emchat, ruler of Rechenu. And it means, and archaeologists all agree with this, it means that he is the ruler of the city of Avaris. Now think about this for a minute. He claims to be the ruler of Avaris. Well, we already saw that decades ago that this high person, the son of Sobek that I'm saying is Joseph, he appointed, he was the ruler of the city of Avaris. So think about this. As Joseph would age and Ephraim would grow and become greater in stature, and Joseph would move towards semi-retirement, what would Joseph do? Whom would he appoint as the ruler of the city of Avaris? Who better than the son who received the birthright, Ephraim? So Ephraim can be this D. Sobek Emchat. D. Sobek Emchat means he who was appointed by Sobek Emchat. All right, Chebeded. You know what his name means? This is really fascinating. Chebeded means he who was disfavored. He who was disfavored. What happened to Manasseh when the blessing was given to Ephraim, his brother, and not to him? Favor was taken away from Manasseh. The only time in Egypt's entire history when anyone was ever called Chebeded, and this is a perfect passive participle in Middle Egyptian, the only time is here with this Chebeded guy, he who was disfavored. No one else was ever called that we know of in Egyptian history. And I've checked all the books. Nobody. He was disfavored. Now we're back to the Serabit el-Khadim mines. There you see the mines. There's the stela here. And so we have all of these stelae. And here's one that we already saw, Sinai 112. We looked at this. And this gives the name of this guy here who's an attendant. It's Kekbi. And the guy sitting on the donkey is Chebeded. He was disfavored. And there's this young boy here that's in front of the donkey. And every time Chebeded goes down for a new expedition, he depicts this boy on our right as taller and taller and taller and taller. And only once does he name him. And it's in this inscription. And do you know what he names this? You see him? You see how much taller he is now? Here he is in relation to the donkey. This was some years earlier. He's shorter. Now he's taller, and here it gives his name. In good Middle Egyptian, that's Shechem. Shechem. Well, if you were to go to Joshua 17:2, you would find the names of Manasseh's children. It's the only place in the Bible you find it. One of his sons is named Shechem, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Shechem. All it's different is a vowel, and that means nothing. Because Shechem, the Hebrew version, actually may be wrong. It may have been Shechem originally. So this boy who's in front of the donkey in all these pictures, he's named Shechem, which is the name of Manasseh's son, he who was disfavored. And that's Chebeded. And Chebeded, his title is brother of the ruler of Retinue. Then who is the ruler of Retinue? That's his brother, Ephraim. And Ephraim's name is Di Sobek Emchat. So who is Sobek Emchat? And with our last moments, we get into our final slideshow. Who is Sobek Emchat? Who's the guy who appointed Di Sobek Emchat as the the ruler or mayor of the city? Well, we go to Dashur. It's this site right here, and this is the pyramid of Sesostris III, who's the what pharaoh? Famine pharaoh. So Joseph would have overlapped in his official viziership during the reign of Sesostris II and Sesostris III, meaning when Sesostris III started his reign, his first vizier had to be Joseph. Watch this. There is a drawing of his pyramid. Here are the royal pyramids around it. Here is the court. So all of these pyramids are enclosed because it's royalty. And then to the lower right is a set of 3 vizirial mastabas. These are burial tombs. Very nice, very elaborate burial tombs of viziers. And the first one, the largest one, every Egyptologist who has studied this site said that had to be Sesostris III's first vizier. Guess, folks, what his name is. There it is, right there. Sobek Emchat. Oh my goodness. Sobek Emchat, the first vizier of Sesostris III, appointed Di Sobek Emchat, he whom Sobek Emchat appointed as the mayor of Avaris, the same city that Sa Sobek, son of Sobek, was the controller of before. So what would have happened? Joseph would have had 2 early names, Sa Sobek and Horamchat. And then later in time, those 2 conflate into one. And if you conflate them, it becomes Sobek is at the forefront. So you're looking at a person who is connected to the life-giving water of the Nile and puts that God at the forefront. That's Joseph also. And the final thing we'll look at is this this funerary inscription. So this inscription was found not in Sobek Emchat's mastaba. And by the way, the French excavators about a century ago, more than a century ago now, who excavated the site of Dashur and excavated the mastabas there, when they excavated the mastaba of Sobek-Amchat, guess what they found? That the body was robbed out in antiquity. What happened to Joseph when he died? Yeah. He was buried but taken back and buried finally, conclusively, in Canaan. It fits perfectly. Look at this title. So it gives some of his titles here, and then we come to this one in the, it's dark blue for me, and here it is, controller of the entire land. Controller of the entire land. What does it say in Genesis 41:41? That's the role, one of the roles that Pharaoh gave to Joseph. He gave him control of the entire land of Egypt. And this is so unprecedented in Egyptian history, folks, that the world's foremost authority on Middle Kingdom titles said that this was a mistake that needed to be corrected. It's a mistake. He changed the translation to something else because nobody could be controller of the entire land. Only the king would be the controller of the entire land. But Joseph received that title, and so does this guy, Sobek-Amchat. Isn't this amazing? Wow. God has pieced all this together for us to see. Why? So that we would know he's done all these things that the Bible says that he did in ancient history. Let's rejoice together because he is the true and living God, and his word will be validated throughout history and eternity. Amen? Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Petrovich. We will take a few minutes for questions, and the way we'll do that is allow you to line up. We have a microphone toward the back and also one toward the front. When you come to the microphone, just speak clearly into it. The sound technicians will adjust the volume as needed, and we ask that you avoid giving any speeches yourself, but rather have a focused question as you ask our presenter what you'd like to know. Thank you.
If you want to give a speech, you can give it to me afterward. I'll hear. I thought I stole all of your time for questions. Don't be shy. All I can do is say, I don't know. That's the worst that can happen.
You, sir, in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
So it's a pleasure being able to see you in person. That's great. Question number one is a Joseph question. Second one is a Moses question. What is your impression of the Tel el-Daba Joseph statue? Do you believe that was Joseph, the one that was broken?
Okay. Can I save the Moses one for tomorrow?
Sure.
Is that right? Because we're going to do Moses tomorrow.
Okay.
So I know that David Roll has suggested that this, and it's actually in my slideshow, I just didn't get to it. That last third slideshow, it's in there. It's what came next.
Sure.
You just barely didn't get to see it. I'm convinced that that is a statue of Jacob, not Joseph. And David Roll said it's Joseph. But he's kind of just taking an educated guess. I looked much more carefully at the scholarly literature that discussed that statue. And I argue very methodically, point by point, in my book as to why that's the case. It fits with all of the, what's called the statuary, meaning all of the statues that are made during the reign of Amenemhat III, who, remember, he takes the throne in 1859, the same year that who dies? Jacob dies in that year. And there is part of an inscription, there was an inscription there, oh my, if we only had the entire inscription, you wouldn't believe, I'm sure, what was on there. But there was one word on there that means incense. And that's typically added to a funerary inscription. And there's a formula that's used for a certain kind of inscription because of an event that took place. It's called the Chetep Dinesu. It's the offering that the king presents in honor of, for the help of the person who died. So what you're doing is you're assuming that the king, it didn't always happen this way, you're assuming that the king is blessing your death and kind of helping usher you into eternity favorably. So the king, figuratively, makes this, adds this sacrifice to allow you to have good things happen to you in eternity, right? So part of that formula is incense. And there's virtually no doubt that the word incense, that's part of this statue that survived, is from a Chetep Dinesu formula. And that only happens when someone dies.
Okay.
Joseph didn't die until 1805.
Right.
You wouldn't make a dedicatory statue to honor him at death until he dies. But he dies long after Amenemhat III dies. It's several rulers later when he dies.
And
So-
would there have been a reason why that statue would have been destroyed, or is it just the ravages of time?
There would have been a reason, we just don't know what it is. And it absolutely could have been racially instigated. Anti-Jewish, anti-Hebrew.
Okay, I'll save the other one for tomorrow then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question from the front, please.
I was wondering if you could talk about the preservation of those archaeological sites in Avarice and why 3,800 years of Nile River channel migration hasn't wiped them out.
Well, remember that this is near the end of the Nile's course, so it's a much stronger, less powerful, because it's been diverted into so many channels. It's less powerful there. So you're never really going to get it to overflow and flood in such a way that it just completely devastates the entire area. And most of the places that were settled, they're tells, which is a mound. And smaller ones often are called turtlebacks in Egypt, and especially in the Nile Delta. So they were all high enough above the highest point at which the Nile flood, even in the worst floods, would get. And they knew that. They pretty much knew that, right? After hundreds of years, they knew where that level was. So that's how they survive. But I have to say this, a lot can't be excavated by archaeology at a site like that because of the high water table underneath the ground, because that will disturb any remains that go up to that level of that water table. So that's a problem.
And now a question from the back again.
Thank you, Dr. Petrovich. So you talk about Ephraim and Manasseh being elevated even possibly above the other 11 brothers of Jacob. And I was wondering, besides the two brothers sort of legitimizing and assimilating the 11 brothers, would they also not have sort of elevated them, and really like the whole tribe would just have become this powerhouse because they would have had all the resources of the two brothers invested in them and not just like the brothers taking care of them.
Right, and certainly, that's part of what Jacob knew, is sending them to Avaris would mean, it's like sending Fort Knox. It's full of gold, right? You send all of that wealth that would allow things to happen that otherwise would never happen. So that gave them, I think, the boost they needed. And of course, we'll look at this, I think, tomorrow a little bit. But the Israelites, the early Israelites there, they were extremely prosperous. They weren't just barely getting by. They were prospering. God was prospering them. And the turquoise mines, those were, the work that they did there, that was a huge part of their prosperity. And the other part, I guess I don't know the Lutheran position on alcohol, so I'm just going to be honest here and tell you the reality. So if this doesn't sit well with you, I apologize, and you can scold me later. But the other, in fact, far more lucrative industry that they entered in was middlemen selling wine that was made in the Levant and selling it to the Egyptians and anyone else who would trade with the Egyptians, like the Nubians. That is where they made their money. The chief excavator there at Avaris, Manfred Bitak, he suggested that there were, what was the number he used? It's in my book. It's something like, he suggested there were, I think, 6 million gallons of wine imported over the centuries in the second millennium BC from the Levant to Egypt. Think of that, 6 million gallons of wine. Think how much money you make on that as a middleman, folks. You are rich.
Thank you. One final question this evening.
Yeah, the land of Goshen, is there any evidence for that name in this area? And is this where Mike Lindell grows his Giza dream sheets?
I don't know about the dream sheets, but Goshen is a hard word to peg. It's a hard site to understand in its fullness. We mainly think that it's a greater region in which Avaris was found. But we don't really have any that I know of, and I've looked into this and I haven't found any good evidence, but from what we know, we do not know the borders of Goshen. But it was probably a territory, kind of like a state or a county, whatever you want to think of it as. And it probably had its own borders at the time, but we just don't know what those were. So Avaris is the smaller entity and Goshen is